long-term results. And actually, first time I saw it was in Cleveland in 2005. So it's been there for almost more than 15 years or 20 years now. So I believe there's enough evidence to support its use. However, I have a question because the augment, as we always speak about, is the tangible augment by Zimmer, right? But there are many other augments available in the market for almost 10 years now. So I would like to know your experience using other augments, all of you. And also another question regarding the human mobility, because in the States of North America, most of human use is the modular. And we don't have enough evidence to support this use because it's exactly like the metronome method or the research thing that Martin was talking about. It was perfect for the learning habit, and then all the companies started producing it, relying on modifications that ended with catastrophic failure. So it's the human mobility research has been there for almost 40 years with excellent results, but now we're putting another articulation, the backside of the method with the method. So why not go to the standard monoblock, as you call it, human mobility?
So actually, my experience with the other types of tantalum, I used titanium augments. And the difficulty with these titanium augments that it is not like tantalum. You cannot read through. It is a little bit stiff. But I mean, if you use it in type 2A or type 2B, it is it's not bad. I mean, the bone integration is okay. I follow up these cases, and there's a good bone integration, but it is not like the tantalum.
Yeah, I agree. I think that important thing to remember here is going back to the basic principles, and is that if you look at Alan Ross, which has one of the largest series in this complex pelvic reconstructions, is that you need to have at least 50% of your acetabular component in a position with healthy bone. Because basically what he showed was that was the main predictor of long-term survivorship. If you are able to accomplish 50% of appositions, you get bony ingrowth. And the augments just help you to get the cup in a stable position until that bony ingrowth happens. So some people even say that you can, I mean, that's the role of bone graft, or even you can put an augment, I mean, I'm exaggerating here, but a piece of plastic that doesn't necessarily have to have bony ingrowth, as long as it helps you to keep the acetabular component in good position so you have bony ingrowth. So I think that the future is just going to show, and actually in China are using different materials, different type of augments just to accomplish that point.
Most of the manufacturers now have another copy of some kind of copy of titanium or whatever, augment, whether it's custom made or prefabricated or whatever. I'm asking, do you have personally experience with different kinds of augments?
Yeah, so I use the Stryker ones. The Stryker ones are not, they don't have the advantages from the trabecular metal ones, the tantalum ones where you can put screws through, like drill through or ring through. They don't have that advantage. But I think that they are feasible enough to, I mean, they have good position for the screws, and again, they are successful meeting the main purpose of just helping to keep the acetabular component in the right position so you get long-term fixation. Now, to answer your second question about dual mobility, so at least the early evidence when they do, so there's a paper from Peter Sharkey that they look at measured anion levels, chromium and cobalt, on modular dual mobilities, and they didn't show that there was a correlation between failure or increased levels that can potentially predict corrosion in this modular implant. And actually, Doug Paget at HSS just published another paper. They look at some retrievals of that modular component of the dual mobility, and they didn't show major corrosion. So at least the early data I'm with you, there is a concern, but at least the early data is not indicative that potentially is going to be a problem long term.
Let me put it in a different way. Why are you using the modular one, not the standard monoblock one?
So, yeah.
Screws.
So,
The other one has screws also.
yeah, well, there are a couple of reasons. One is because it gives you some versatility. If you don't necessarily want to use dual mobility, then you have the option of using, yeah, exactly, the same shell. You don't have to take the shell out. So it has some advantages to have a modular mechanism. When we use the monoblock one, which is the ADM, that is, has an anatomic groove for the psoas in the anterior aspect of the cup. The problem is that you cannot see if you are all the way down, and it doesn't give you the same feeling. I mean, it's, you know, it's like talking about politics of religion. There are the little things here and there that we don't necessarily have facts, that we just feel more comfortable with one or the other. And we don't really have penetration of the market by the French companies that do the monoblock one. So it's just, I think that is a circumstantial issue, that we just had a big company, Stryker, that just popularized the use of dual mobility in the US.
Thank you.
I'll just add a couple of things. So I actually like the shape of the Stryker augments better. I find them easier to use. But I do like the flexibility of the tantalum to be able to drill through it. I think that's a really nice advantage. The other comment I would make is, you know, Carlos's comments about Dr. Gross saying you have to have 50%. I actually look at it a little differently today, because when Gross really published those recommendations, it was before the days of augments. It was before we had ways to extend the ingrowth surfaces. So today, when you use an augment, you're going to place your shell, you're going to place your augment, you're going to put cement in between the two of them. It really does create a single entity, so your surface area to draw that 50% from is now greater. So I would look at it a little differently in that when Alan Gross talked about 50% bone apposition, we talked about it with the shell. I will tell you today, if you have even 20 or 30% of good bone apposition to the shell, but a very stable construct because you have augments around it stabilizing it that are also going to get ingrowth, that seems to work pretty well.
You continue to sing between the augment and the cup.
Yes.
That sounds
Yeah, but in the US, if you don't put it, then it's off-label. So the labeling does recommend it. Yeah, it is, yeah. And then your second question about the dual mobility, just the one comment I would make is, although we don't have long-term outcome results from the US, there are long-term outcome results from France that are published on the dual mobility that seem to show that it's very good. I think what we're struggling with in the US is trying to determine who is the right patient. Is it the young, highly active person that you want to use it in, or is it the low, truly high-risk patient with the alcohol resistance patient, or is it both?
الفكرة انها تبقى مضمونة ان انا اعرف
هي مش مضمونة ما دام معاك ايدي.
انت منين اصلا؟
يا باشا انا هنقابلك في الدبلومة.
انا عارف يا عم انت منين؟
انت بروح.
لا روح هو انا قاعد هنا لان انا السلام عليكم لان الرساله بتاعت المواحد بتاع ارثروبلاستي بيتكلم في موضوع الجيوم البليت، فانا قاعد غصب عني.
بس خليك
قاعد غصب عني.
ها؟ عارف انا قاعد بس خليك.
ما انا بقول لك قاعد غصب عني.
ايديات وجبنا شهادات احنا لازم نعمله في الدعم.
هو نشوف ربنا ييسر سيبنا خلاص. لو نفع
يعني لو
ما نفعش بقى تعمل ايه؟
ولا اي حاجه.
لو ما نفعش هتعملوا ايه؟
ارميه.
ازاي بس؟
ارمي الايديات يعني.
انا على فكره ما ذاكرتش حاجه لسه.
ولا احنا ذاكرنا.
يعني انا لسه ما ذاكرتش حاجه.
ولا انا عارف الامتحان ولا انا عارف احنا لغايه هذه اللحظه الاستفاده مش الاستفاده اللي انا ادفع لها 7 بصراحه يعني.
بص اللي انا اعرفه ان انت مش هتفهم غير بعد شهر واحد. 2 3 4 5 يبقوا كويسين. 9 10 11 12 ده اقصى. وستيل في ناس تقيله جايه، في شمع غني جاي، في ناس
مش يعني معلش انا
لا يا
بعتذر على
باشا،
التدخين.
لا لا يا باشا خالص خالص. سيب، لا 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 ما اقصدش والله، سيب الايديهات وربنا ييسر.
جزاك الله خير.
تسلم
شكرا.
حضرتك، تسلم. يلا سلام.
Again, the invention. And for all the people, young, old, revision, non-revision, we are using that with a high survival rate. So it depends what we are speaking about, what durability from what company. It's not the same polyethylene, it's not the same metal bag, it's not the same material.
The canal triangle for finding the canals that day.
So what I do is when I expose the femur, there's a curved curette or some element that allows me to penetrate inside the canal. But to answer your question, yes, I do use something that allows me to know that I'm inside the canal. I don't use the canal finder as per se, I use a curved curette to go into the canal.
Can you reconstruct the sternum through the same approach? If you need to reconstruct the sternum. And the other question, if you have problems with the femur during the surgery, what do you do?
So for the acetabular exposure, it's a very extensive approach. I can go up all the way through the pelvis and bring down the TFL and have very good exposure of the outer table. And for the femur, as that last article that I showed, you can extend your incision all the way down to the femoral condyle, doing a vastus splitting and preserving the neurovascular bundles for the vastus, and you can have very good exposure. One of our partners in the clinic also does a separate incision if he encounters any issues with the femur. And so it'll be one incision where the approach is, and a lateral incision over the shaft of the femur if there's any need for excising the femur.
My question, what semen type, high viscosity, low viscosity, and standard viscosity, does it affect the result of primary and revision surgery? And second, for total knee and total leg replacement in primary and revision surgery. Can you comment?
Sure. So the first comment I would make is I tend to use a high viscosity cement if I want something to set up quickly. You know, if I'm trying to get in and out of a case quickly and the patient is ill or something, I want to there is some good data that shows that specific cements have better antibiotic eluting principles than others. So what I might use in my primaries and even in my revisions, if I'm not putting antibiotics in the cement, and to be clear, we do not at the clinic routinely use antibiotic cement in primaries anymore. We actually studied that and we found that antibiotic cements actually increase the risk of resistant organism infections. So that's important. That was a Knee Society presentation that we had 2 years ago, and we've now completely stopped using it prophylactically in the prophylactic side. So that's important. So otherwise I would use standard viscosity cement. So I usually use Simplex, other than in infection cases where I use the Zimmer cement because it has better drug-eluting properties. And in that case I use the Zimmer cement.
Actually, it's interesting that you do anterior capsulectomy, as I may understand from your presentation. What's my question about it? How would you go for posterior release beyond the capsule? What's your approach beyond the capsule? You release the triangle of the posterior capsule. You already did the anterior capsulectomy, and now the femur does not go. So we need to go for the rotators. Maybe how would you do that?
So normally with that release, before extending distally through the posterior aspect of the cortex of the femoral neck, before that, I normally say that in 80–90% of the cases, you're able to elevate the femur without incising the external rotators. I think the main resection or release that you have to do is that thick capsule on the posterior superior aspect. And actually there's a study that shows that that is the tensioning and tethering point of the femur to extract.
But if need be, you can release down the external rotators. As long as the posterior inferior capsule, it remains intact, it could give you a lot of stability in the posterior part.
Regarding the cases you have encountered periprosthetic fracture with short stems, do you think this was a matter of learning curve, or is just the geometry of the proximal femur or the approach?
Actually, what I used for all these cases was the MIS posterior approach, and I find no problem in using this approach with the short stem. It's actually a learning curve. 5 of these cases happened in the, as far as I remember, about in the first 30 cases. So it is a learning curve. And the problem, if you use some instruments which have been in the market for some time, is you may get some medullary instruments which are a little bit eroded and a little bit smaller than the actual prosthesis. And when you put the actual prosthesis in, the final prosthesis in, you may end by fracture of the femur, especially the neck. So it's actually learning curve.
Second point, regarding the question about cementing of the primary knee or so, regarding the viscosity of the cement, as far as I remember, there is a paper early this year coming from Prague, I think from the CHSS, talking about the bonding of the component, tibial component from the cement increased with the usage of high viscosity cement. Are you aware of, or you have experience with this?
Yeah, I don't normally use high viscosity cement in that setting. So where I might use a high viscosity cement, for example, is if I'm doing a hip fracture and I just need cement to cement a stainless polished stem into place. In that case, I'm not looking for it to bond to anything, and I want it to set up relatively quickly. So that would be the kind of scenario that I would use. In my knees, just as an aside, my primary knees, 90% of my primary knees now are cementless. I don't use any cement in my knees at all, including on the toe.
Regarding the way you mix the cement?
Yes, it's vacuum mixed, which I do think is important to really get rid of all of the bubbles and any air vacuums. I use 3rd generation cement techniques where, you know, if I'm going into a canal, I have a cement restrictor. I put it all in. I pressurize the cement hard. I pressurize it hard, including if I'm cementing a primary knee or a revision knee, for example. I'll actually put the cement on top, and I'll finger pack it hard into all that cancellous bone. Another area where it's very important is in unicompartmental knee replacements. If you do unicompartmental knees, you have a smaller surface area that you're cementing into. So really pack it into the cancellous bone, because that's where you really get that good interdigitation and that good fit.
Yeah, and that particular paper is related to just one particular implant, the PUAL tune, that had a different substrate, and the metallurgy of the back of the tibia was different. Because of that, they have to change it. So they actually, the PU changed all those tibia components after that.
Is the dual mobility compatible in patient with hemiplegic or polio patient with muscle grade less than 3? Or after conversion of arthrodesis to titanium?
Yeah. So those are all what you mentioned are risk factors for instability, and I use dual mobility in primary total hips in those circumstances.
One potential benefit that you have in polio patients, if they have severe weaknesses, is it's not infrequent that their leg is a little bit shorter on that side too. So if you are doing a hip replacement in them, I think a dual mobility option is a great option. Don't be shy to lengthen them a little bit and to increase their offset a little bit. In that case, you're really improving your risk of your chances of having a highly stable implant. Traditionally, the use of constrained liners, I think, has really fallen off. The stresses are too high, so if you can avoid a constrained liner, that's much better. So if their leg is a little short, take advantage of it. Make them a centimeter longer, increase their offset a little bit. use as big a head as you're comfortable using with the dual mobility, and the chances are you have a very good stable head.
In our country, we use the dual mobility most probably after trauma. So the complicated fractures, neck-of-femur and tendinitis, if it is need to be converted into total. So we used, most of the cases, we use the cemented cups, cemented shells. So do you have any experience about cemented shells?
Yeah, we actually, so in the US, they have, Smith & Nephew has one particular, it's the only component that is FDA approved to be used cemented inside an acetylene shell. So it's a metal liner that is cemented into metal. I guess you can do it. I do it more on the revision setting where I just, instead of taking the whole shell out, I just cement this particular liner in. The disadvantage of it is that it has to be at least a 52 millimeter shell to be able to fit it, because you need to have at least 1 to 2 millimeters of layer of cement to put it in.
I'm asking because one of the alternatives in resurfacing was to use a cemented shell, and this was a failure. They chose to have a cementless metal shell and cemented femoral head. So why this is a failure while dual mobility we use the metal shells cemented here in Egypt?
I think one of the things to be very careful about, because we have a similar issue in the US, not so much with failed resurfacings, but with failed metal on metal hip replacements. And I think the risk that we have if you use, for example, a Smith & Nephew shell, the type of shell that Carlos is describing, with a resurfacing or with a large metal head, is that the tolerances between the manufacturers may be different. And if you think back to the failures of the, like McKee-Ferrar, the very first metal on metal hips that were being used, they failed because the tolerances were not tight enough. So if you're using a different head, one manufacturer, if you have polyethylene, you have a little wiggle room, but if it's metal on metal, that wiggle room is wrong. The clearance, exactly. Those tolerances create a difference in clearance, where you can get either polar loading, or you can get, essentially, you can have the bearing almost seized and take the cup out. So in the cases where Carlos is describing, where we'll take that Smith & Nephew shell, which does have a metal backing, which is a scratch fit, you can actually cement that right into the shell or right into the bone. So I've actually cemented right into the acetabulum and used that in infection cases, and I put antibiotics in that cement and a large head on the femoral side behind the surgeons.
Well, if you can comment on that, actually, all the long-term survival of the cementous surf dual mobility. The cemented, if you look at the literature, you find most of the literature regarding the cemented is not that good. Except what paper that was published almost a year ago, they showed survival, 5-year survival of a cemented cup that was 96 or 98 as far as I remember. However, if you look at the survival with the cemented cup in addition to a ring, whatever type of ring, whether Kerpool or Schneider, it reaches 85% at 10 years, 95% at 10 years. So the French are producing the cemented cup to be used in addition to a ring, not isolated cemented cup. And that's the recommendation so far. However, there are starting to be limited evidence that we can use the cemented without a ring. However, it's not that recommendable. There's no enough evidence to support that.
Another thing is, we're writing that paper, actually, we just did this study a year ago, is that for the cemented component, one thing that plays a significant role is the position of the component on the pelvic plane in terms of abduction and inclination. Because sometimes, especially with bad deformity, if you don't have good congruency between the component and the defect, and you try to play with that to improve the abduction and the version of the component, if you change too much the position of the component, is more than 20 degrees in relation to the pelvic plane, actually that's the main predictor of failure, of airway failure, rather than the thickness of the cement mantle, which was just really the thing that we were trying to do. This is an in vitro study, by the way, but that's what we found. If it's more than 20 degrees of difference in terms of abduction and inclination in relation to the pelvic plane, then there's a risk failure for early failure for the cemented.
So with that, I think we'll turn things over. I want to thank Dr. Hassan, my co-moderator, and all of our speakers. I think this was a great session. And we'll turn things over to Dr. Hassan.